disorder is not distinct from its indicators. So you can't have a trauma-exposed person who's asymptomatic who really has PTSD, which you could say this one really has lung cancer even if he doesn't have any symptoms yet. Okay, the network approach then to psychopathology sees that symptoms constituting a network of functionally interrelated elements. So the idea here is the symptoms are constitutive of the disorder. They constitute the disorder. They don't reflect its presence. So in some sense, there's no disorder there other than that which this whole system that you are seeing. So the relationship between symptoms and disorder is mereological, part to whole, not reflective. And so the elements in network analysis overall are nodes, which in our case are symptoms. I should say parenthetically, it's even using the word symptom presupposes the reflective model. A symptom of what? Well, symptom of the underlying disorder. By the way, I suppose you can't use that term anymore. Well, Don Robb and I, we were writing one of our papers. We had these long, cognitive behavioral affective element. Too complicated. I'm just using the word symptom here, even though I realize that term, it shows you how embedded this model is. We never think twice about it. It presupposes a reflective model. Well, I'm going to ignore that for the moment. Okay. Okay, we have nodes and we have edges. The edges are connections between symptoms, and they are usually depicted as various correlations, measures of association. And the strength of association in the graphs that are returned by network analysis, the strength, the magnitude is reflected by the width, the darkness of the edge, as you'll see. Then there's also measures of node centrality. This, I think, is a really important, cool thing about the network analysis. It can identify which nodes, symptoms, are central, that are important to the causal system that constitutes the disorder under investigation. Now, this is different from what we call a hallmark symptom. The DSM process. I was on the DSM-4 PTSD and specific phobia committee, and I was an outside advisor on panic disorder and PTSD for this one. I wasn't part of the committee that can be blamed for the DSM-5. I can be blamed for DSM-4, maybe a little bit on those. But this. What was my point? Oh, yes, right, the hallmark symptoms. Yeah. DSM, a senior moment, as they call it. The hallmark symptoms, those are the symptoms of a mental disorder that distinguish it from other symptoms, right? That was the whole idea. So in DSM-5, we had a purified diagnostic sense, so we can sort of identify this symptom is a real hallmark. The other ones have nothing to do with the others. It's a hallmark symptom, right? That was the whole point, right? But a network analysis, the hallmark symptoms may not be the central ones. The central ones are the ones that have a lot of connections to other nodes, for example. So with, whoops, darn it. Okay, so you can talk about the node strength, there's several senses of centrality. This one I think is the most important. So you can have one symptom that's connected to a lot of other symptoms. And the magnitude of those connections is very strong. As you add up these connection weights, etc., and so you get the strength of the node. So this may or may not be a hallmark symptom of the disorder, but it's one that's really important, because if you turn on that symptom, it's going to spread activation to other ones. And that's going to cause problems. In Graham Davies' talk, he raised the question about if you turn on a particular symptom, why doesn't everybody get the disorder? Well, this is going to have to do with a number of things, and one is the degree to which it's well connected to other symptoms. If those connections are not that strong, somebody might have an isolated symptom, rumination, for example, and not develop the other ones. Okay. There's other measures of centrality, closeness, how close you are to the other ones, that highly correlate with strength, and also betweenness, how often a node lies on the shortest path link between two other nodes. Okay, so if symptom A it can affect symptom C, but it's got to go through symptom B. That means B has a count of 1 in that case for betweenness, and the more that's the common switchboard symptom, the more important it's going to be. Okay. So here I'm just going to show some data from childhood sexual abuse survivors recruited from the Cambridge-Boston community. They're both PTSD cases and non-PTSD, but they all have symptoms. They're all in the sense that they've been exposed to these events. We use the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, the standard DSM-4 measure for this. Now, the results. The association network here, this depicts the connections among all the symptoms. It's a little bit easier to see the important ones. If you zero in on, boy, some of these, it's harder to see the circles here, unfortunately. Okay, what you see here, for example, these are dreams, flashback, and intrusive thoughts about the trauma. These, in fact, as you're probably not too surprised, are highly connected. You got very thick edges connecting these. So this sort of replicates kind of what we've sort of known clinically about the criterion B symptoms, the re-experiencing symptoms. Excuse me. We also get very strong connections between hypervigilance and startle responses. And we see connections between anger and concentration problems, ones that you would not necessarily see. Now, way out here in left field, to use a baseball expression here, is amnesia for aspects of the trauma. There actually are some edges here. You have to have very good eyes to see them. I can't even see them from here, but they're very, very weak. And so this notion about you can't remember parts of your trauma is not something that seems to be connected with the rest of the syndrome. Now, this is an association network is simply the correlations among the different symptoms. Now, it's what's called a non-directed network. These are just correlations. We don't know which way the thing is pointing. It's not a causal sort of network, but it's sort of a first step in trying to elucidate what a causal network might be. The node centrality, interesting. Here are the ones that were at the highest node strength, numbers of connections and strong ones. Distance from others, physiological reactivity, anger and concentration problems. So this is exactly what I'm referring to here. These symptoms are highly connected to other symptoms with this sexual abuse survivor group. These are not what you would call hallmark symptoms of PTSD. It's not the intrusive recollection, flashback, or numbing, right? Those are the things that really set PTSD off. But the things that are important in the sense of being central and well-connected are not hallmark ones here. Closeness, it gives us the same things. Betweenness, anger, and loss of interest, that these mediated connections between a lot of others. Now, one thing you can ask here is, well, all right, we have this we have association network. Maybe what we want to do is to see whether an association still abides, it's still there when we control for the presence of all the other symptoms. A concentration network analysis does that. It's like a partial correlation analysis. So the question is, once all the dust settles and you've controlled for everything else, which of these associations still are there? Which ones are apparently directly associated once the dust settles, once you control for all the other things? All right. This is not coming through very clearly here, unfortunately. But we find that, for example, hypervigilance and startle, that these still remain strongly connected. Dreams, flashbacks, and intrusive symptoms, the associations are weakened somewhat, but they still are there. These seem to be real candidates for associations here. Loss of interest, distance, and numbing. Again, these also, remain. This is really tough. It doesn't look like there's anything here from this screen, unfortunately. A relative importance network. What this is here, this asks the question: to what extent is a symptom a good predictor of another symptom when you take into account all the other symptoms that are present, and then look at the proportionate contribution? It's this LMG metric. So to try to translate this into English, it is a directed network. So you're asking about, it's a little bit akin to a partial correlation analysis, but it's sort of a directed one. It's not causal, but it's getting closer and closer to getting a causal sense. So what you find here with these symptoms, you actually find a lot of looping effects, where you find intrusive symptoms is a strong predictor of dreams of flashbacks of intrusions. And so you actually don't have just sort of it's not an acyclic graph where you get one symptom activating another and a chain like this, but it sort of loops around, okay? And we see the same sort of phenomenon over here with startle and hypervigilance, right? over here, and also with distance, loss of interest, and so forth. And so what you wind up getting is you get some of these symptoms, the looping effect shows why they're maintaining one another. One leads to activation, activates another until it sort of hits its, if you will, natural limit. Now the last data set I want to show here in the closing minutes here, we looked at network analysis with complicated grief and depression to elucidate the structure, if you will, of PCBD and clarify its comorbidity with depression. Now, these are not clinical data. These are data from a prospective longitudinal study done in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, and also its suburbs as well, by Ron Kessler when he was at U of M, University of Michigan at the time. And it's a really developmental study. Ron is actually a sociologist by training, best known for his psychiatric epidemiology work. But what he was doing here was the study on changing lives of older couples, the clock study, and looking at developmental changes in these older individuals. The subjects were men 65 years or older, or women married to men who are 65 years or older. There are multiple assessments over time, and of course you have dropouts. But for our purposes, you also had spousal bereavement occurring. And I'm just going to move through here fairly quickly. What we did here, to get at the PCBD symptoms, they measured grief symptoms. As I mentioned earlier, this has been a topic of study for quite some time in psychiatry. And so Ron Kessler had included a lot of the standard grief symptoms, many of which map into the ones that we have in the DSM-5 PCBD criteria. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so we were able to study those. They also gave the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. Again, that's not all of the symptoms of depression, but at least we could get a sense at the connection between depression and grief here. The most frequently endorsed symptoms here were yearning and loss of identity. So they were frequently endorsed. And the association network here, oh boy, this is again going to be challenging. What we find here, this is emotional pain in the middle of the network. And my student Don, he's got this sort of a zooming in thing. He loves to do this stuff. I borrowed this slide from Don. You probably still can't see it, unfortunately, on the screen here. But you see, but the symptoms, very high central one, is actually emotional pain. This is the one that was going to be tossed out of the DSM. And lo and behold, this physical embodiment of emotion. Emotional pain is very strong, connected to feeling empty, longing for the deceased person, the yearning one, thoughts about the deceased, and so forth. And so here's the degree of the node. We actually analyzed data on strength, which is the number of edges, the number of connections, and their strength. But this is just the degree, which is simply the count of the number of edges. And you can see right here that pain is directly connected to a whole boatload of other symptoms. So emotional pain, this symptom that wasn't even going to be put in the criteria set, is the most central one. You turn on emotional pain, you get activation spreading throughout this network. Well, answering the question about why do some symptoms get activated, not others? Why doesn't everybody have them all? Between us, we also get emotional pain. There's an example of that, the bridging thing here. Okay, so these are, we've got the different degree and degree closeness and betweenness measures. I'm going to skip these here. I just tell you, but point out the highlights. We then also ran a relative importance network again. And once again, what we find here is we find emotional pain being highly central, producing thoughts of the death, and then to avoidance behavior, etc., which then projects back to emotional pain, which suggests that what might be happening, get the emotional pain, thoughts of the death you try to avoid, and then that makes more emotional pain. So like a Dan Wagner, thought suppression, white bear kind of an effect. And we get numbness and shock, and loneliness, feeling empty, and life being meaningless, and so forth. So again, we get these sort of looping effects appearing here, once again, that are likely keeping the symptom activated. There goes that moving graph again. Okay. Now, the issue here with comorbidity. Everybody regards comorbidity as a problem. We must get rid of the comorbidity, clarify our data sets, sharpen the boundaries. And the idea is to throw out all the symptoms that are, the noise, the symptoms that are shared by multiple conditions. How is that, right? That's the whole purpose. under the latent variable model. And there is a lot of depression here, as you might imagine. Half of currently, about 3/4 of lifetime. And you see that actually, we look at depression, look at grief, there is some substantial phenomenological overlap. We have emotional numbing, anhedonia, negative intrusive memories, difficulty imagining the future, loneliness, rumination, and the like. And this is sort of the model under the traditional approach. You have these two discrete disorders, and then you've got symptoms that are connected with grief and such as yearning, and then ones like anhedonia, loss of pleasure in activities. That's sort of in between. Is it really a symptom of grief, or is it really as a symptom of depression? And so what do we do with that? You know, if you're a traditional DSMer, you throw it out because it's just noise, right? But in network analysis, not at all. In fact, what the situation is, what is a problem with our traditional approach suddenly becomes something really important, called bridge symptoms, right? So the things that are connected to two different conditions, you got anhedonia, for example, loneliness, of just feeling sad. Well, you know, that they overlap with both of these conditions. They're bridges. And so you can see, from instead of being a nuisance variable, a nuisance symptom that's sort of getting in the way and correlating with everything, it becomes really important, because if you turn on a bridge symptom, if you activate that one, and it's got a lot of edges, they're going to go this way and that way at the same time. They'll activate, set off the depression network, and set off the grief network, assuming that the connection strengths are strong enough. So the things that the noise are actually very important symptoms here. The ones that are lying right at the border have a foot, so to speak, in both camps. Okay, so there's an algorithm, these are these physics guys, they call it the spin glass algorithm. Where do they come up with these names? I have no idea. But basically what it does, it can test to what degree symptoms cluster, where the clustering coefficients are greater within a subset of a network than across networks. And so you can see where you can have bridge symptoms and yet have syndromic identity between two different conditions. And this is what happens here. We find that the depression symptoms, we got things like depressed mood, sadness, and numbing and so forth, and emotional pain again. They're sort of right here in the middle. They're kind of the bridges. But nevertheless, the depression symptoms did segregate. They were significantly different. That is to say, the depression symptoms were more highly clustered within themselves than they were with the grief symptoms, and vice versa. So the spin glass algorithm returned a network that showed how you could have two different syndromes and yet a connection between them with these things that are lying right at the edge. Okay, now the last slide here I want to show, oh boy, this is even tougher to see. But one thing that you can do with risk factors, for example, you can break the group out. We did this with high and low social support prior to the person having lost the loved one. Okay, so we know the social support. I shouldn't move my hands around as much. I don't know how many times I bang that thing. Okay, I'll try to stay immobile here. Social support, we know, is a protective factor, right? Protective factor against depression. Sorry about that. I just hope I don't damage it too badly. We know that's the case, and so, well, what you could do, you could take a look, what we did here in this case, we looked at the measures of social support other than the spouse, so other friends and family, and we distinguished high and low social support, and then look at the networks between them. And this slide is really kind of tough to see, unfortunately, but basically what you find is that you've got the edges among the symptoms here are on a circle. This is a different plot. You get the symptoms of a circle. What you have here is that you got the group with low social support has got much stronger edge strength, connections between symptoms in this network. So if you turn on this symptom, it's likely to activate that one, whereas this one here is unlikely to activate this one. Okay, depending upon, unless it's especially severe, because the association strength is not so great. And so what you can do with these things, you can answer the question, how do risk factors affect the occurrence of depression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can break people into the risk factors, look at the networks, And you can see, for example, where the associations are the strength of the associations, what those connections might be. And over time, what we found here is that things tended to weaken. Some of those edges actually disappeared. So, for example, if someone had a tendency to ruminate when they're in a really sad mood, for example, and say they no longer have that tendency, that's in other words of saying that the edge strength has gone to zero. And so if they too tend to be in a sad mood, they'll do something else. They might distract themselves, go running or whatever, but they're not going to start ruminating anymore because the edge strength has gone to zero. So what you can then do is you can see how these different risk factors influence the syndrome at the level of the symptoms. Okay, so just a couple conclusions from network analysis, of the grief analysis here. The central symptoms: emotional pain, thoughts about the death, feelings of emptiness, etc. And so some of those were hallmark symptoms, others not. But the clinical implications of the entire approach to psychopathology, suggested by network analysis, is that what you want to do here is not try to find out markers for the disorder or risk factors for the disorder. You want to take it down a level, to the level of symptoms, to investigate the psychobiology of the symptoms, of insomnia, of hypervigilance, of numbing. And you want to study the psychobiology of the node, so to speak, not the disorder. It's a little wonder that the genomics folks, they take a look at the disorder and they look for various allelic variants, etc., to how they correlate with the whole disorder. It's really, really hard to find anything. One of my psychiatric colleagues finished a study with 35,000 subjects, and they found some signal in all that noise, sent it to Nature, and they said, replicate it. 35,000 subjects. We can't do that in experimental psychopathology. Another 35,000 subjects. Yeah, so I mean, these approaches might do better if you look at the genomics of the symptoms in these networks, not the disorder. So we should also then be treating symptoms, not disorders. And here's where the experimental psychopathology and network analysis convene. What this will suggest is that if, for example, one symptom is a strong predictor of another, in a relative importance network or a concentration network, then if you treat this symptom, if you turn it off, and if that's actually a causal connection, that deactivation ought to propagate, turning off other nodes. Okay, so you can do this experimentally to test hypotheses that emerge from this type of analysis. And by targeting the high centrality symptoms, this is really an important thing to do. And for example, in our earthquake data, we found that sleep disturbance was the most highest one. Certainly not a hallmark of PTSD, but that would suggest if you're going to do exposure therapy, you might want to get someone sleep stabilized. So when you do work on the intrusive symptoms and the physiological reactivity, the fear reduction that occurs during exposure will be well consolidated in the person's memory during sleep. So those symptoms go down. So if you can turn off high centrality symptoms, it'll make it easier to treat other symptoms. There's a whole bunch of clinical implications that come from this new approach. I want to give credits again to Boersboom and his team in Amsterdam that we're working with for really opening up a whole new way of looking at psychopathology. Thank you for your attention.